Hello lovelies and welcome to the video. Today we are doing the full tutorial for the Aphrodite Fashion Corset by the Craefty Witch patterns. The Craefty Witch is my little pattern company where I create size and gender inclusive sewing patterns. Today we're going to be going through my new digital sewing pattern for a fashion corset. The Aphrodite is a reversible underbust style of bodice in a corset, waspy stays, bodies style, and it's designed to layer over your clothing. The Aphrodite has a center front closure and adjustable shoulder straps which tie together. The pattern also provides instructions to add an optional skirt to the bodice. This garment is a fashion statement and not intended to be worn for support. However, the maker can add boning using the instructions to create an historic style silhouette. Full instructions are included to adjust your pattern to meet the needs of your one-of-a-kind shape. This pattern has an adjustable fit with a small amount of ease, so consider this when picking your size. Remember to make a toile. The pattern also has instructions for an adaptive zipper front closure if the wearer desires. View A is simply the bodice. It ties together at the front with rivet or eyelet closures as well as at the shoulders, and it's meant to stop at the natural waist. View B is the same style of bodice but with an added open skirt. This pattern is designed for an intermediate to advanced level sewist. Fabric recommended includes a lining or reverse fabric, and interfacing. This needs to be something that is well structured. Something like duck, drill, or canvas works very well. You can use something softer for the reverse layer, like a quilting cotton or a linen, or even something like a sateen, but this will need to be either interlined or interfaced so that it gives it structure. To create this garment, you need at least 120 centimeters of 112 centimeter wide fabric or 100 centimeters of 120 centimeter wide fabric. You will need to add another 250 centimeters for the skirt add-on. You will need to make sure that you have this much fabric again for your lining or reverse fabric. Seam allowance for this pattern is 2 centimeters, which is 3/4 of an inch, and needs to be trimmed and clipped in most places after it's sewn. The seam allowance is used to create the boning channels. That's why there is so much seam allowance. It also helps if you need to do any fitting adjustments and you haven't done the full toile. You can use the seam allowance to give yourself a little bit more room in places if you need. There is a full section of specialty instructions in the pattern itself. If you need assistance with things like interlining, interfacing, boning, and eyelets, then please refer to this. To select your size, you need to start with your natural waist measurement. This is either the smallest part of your torso. This is the part of your body that is between your ribs and your hips, and it usually is the part where you dip in when you bend to the side. Our smallest size is an 80 centimeter or 31 inch waist. We go all the way up to the waist of 160 centimeters or 63 inches, but we will grade up to any size that you need above this. Just email us if you need. To learn more about our sizing, including our use of gender inclusive language, please head to the Craefty Witch website. Special note on seam allowance. Most corsetry patterns come without any seam allowance. In fact, until the early 20th century, patterns never came with seam allowance at all. The first reason for this is accuracy. Without seam allowance, you have a stitching line to follow marked directly on your fabric. Following this is far more accurate than seam allowances. The second reason is to make alterations and adjustments faster and easier. To make adjustments to a pattern, you need to take the seam allowances off first and then alter. It's just easy to remove them altogether in the first place. So when I'm looking at the pattern, where do I cut? For first timers, I recommend cutting the pattern and the fabric at the outer seam allowance. This is the slightly transparent version of your size line. Cut here first and then transfer this shape onto your fabric using either chalk or a water erasable marker. Then cut out again to reveal the actual pattern and place this inside the seam allowance you've just marked out and remark your pattern. Make sure that for the back center piece, you line up the fold line with the fold line, no matter the seam allowance or not. For advanced sewists, I recommend that you just cut out the pattern itself without any seam allowance and you add your own seam allowance to your liking around the pattern. If you'd like to, you can simply just cut out the actual seam allowance size of the pattern and then use your sewing machine to stitch at the appropriate 2 centimeter or 3/4 of an inch mark. This is not accurate, and you are more likely to have mistakes or missize your pattern if you do this. To create the Aphrodite, you first need to mark your pattern out on your fabric. Both the stitching line and the seam allowance are provided on the pattern. It's a good idea to mark out both. Then you're going to cut the back bodice on the fold. Each panel except the back need to be cut as a mirrored pair. Repeat this for the lining and any interlining or interfacing. If you are choosing to add boning, this is a good time to cut and prepare your boning. This bodice is fully reversible. However, for clarity, I will refer to your pieces of fabric as main and lining. This is simply for the instructions, but every one of these stays that you make is reversible. When cutting your interfacing, you can use the same template. However, you can be more conservative with the amount of seam allowance given. You can also choose to block fuse your interfacing to the entire fabric and then cut out your pieces after the interfacing is attached. If you haven't already, fuse or baste your interfacing to their corresponding main and or lining panels. It's up to you which side you want to put your interfacing on. This is an aesthetic choice. The interfacing gives structure and sturdiness to the fabric, so you may want to do both sides. However, it can also crinkle and create a different texture in the fabric. Consider this when choosing your type of interfacing. Now we need to start construction. Sew panels together at the side seams, right side facing. Make sure that the pieces align at the stitching lines. Pieces 1 and 2 are sewn together first. Pin together at the stitch line and follow the marked stitch line with your sewing machine. This is at a 2 centimeter or 3/4 inch seam allowance. I find it easier when stitching these pieces together to not pre-pin them. Instead, I start with the bottom corner and pin this spot only, and then move bit by bit through the sewing machine in small sections, realigning as I go. This way I'm able to follow the marked stitch line more easily and more accurately. This is because of the complicated curves of the corset. The stitching lines absolutely match. However, the seam allowance does not. There will be some extra odd overhanging parts that are trimmed later. Don't worry about these, and this is also why it's important that you are matching up the stitch lines rather than matching up the side seams. Once you have sewn together pieces 1 and 2, then you can sew together piece 4 with pieces 3. The sewn pieces will no longer lay flat once they've been sewn together, and this is a sign that you've sewn it correctly. It will enable the fabric to curve around your body. Stitch the front pieces, 1 and 2, to the back piece, which is 3s and 4, using the seam allowance. All 5 main pattern pieces should now be sewn together at their side seams. Press and open all of the internal seams, and then repeat each of these steps to put together the pieces for the lining. Finally, press the center front seams in by 2 centimeters. Repeat for both sides, for the main and for the lining. At this point in your pattern, it will say to work on the boning. I'm going to leave this section for later on in the video, and we're going to continue on with construction for now. Your lining and your main should be stitched at their side seams, and we are now going to put them together. Place the main and lining pieces together, wrong sides out, right sides in, and pin and stitch the entire long bottom edge together. This seam should stitch the center front folded edge in place. It should also run across the open and pressed seam allowances. Then pin and stitch together the entire long top edge. this seam again should run through the remaining open end of your seam allowances, as well as through the folded center front. Trim the top and bottom seam allowances to 5mm or 1/4 inch. If you haven't trimmed any of the internal seam allowances, this can be completed now. This is an optional step which reduces bulk. You also need to snip the curved seam allowances so that the seams lay flat once the bodice is turned. Pinking shears can be used when trimming seam allowances. This will help the seams to lay flatter. Now that the top and bottom seams have been stitched, we can turn. To do this, turn the corset right side out by birthing it through one of the open center front seams. This step can seem intimidating, but I promise it can be done. You just need patience and bravery. If you're finding it stressful, then notice that I accidentally did this so quickly that it's difficult for the camera to even focus on what I'm doing. It seems more difficult than what it really is. Once you have turned it, then grab a turning tool or something sort of similar stick-like object to push all of the seams into place. You can use a chopstick like I do, or you can even use a knitting needle. Just something that's not super pointy. A pair of scissors does not work well for this task. Then you need to press all of these seams into place. Just make sure that you check your fabric recommendations before doing this so that you don't ruin your fabric with a too high heat. If you have chosen not to do any boning, then at this point you're going to stitch 2 sets of parallel lines. The first 1/2 inch or 15mm away from the turned center front edge, and another that is simply edge stitched about 2 to 5mm away from the center front. This is just to hold that center front turn section in place and to give a little bit of structure. I do recommend that you add boning into this even if you haven't got boning anywhere else. It helps a lot with the eyelets, keeping them nice and straight and flat when you do up your bodice. You can also top stitch around the entirety of the bodice at this point. Then you can add some stitching in the ditch through all of the seam lines to hold the layers together. Optional boning. To add the optional boning, we're going to use both the seam allowances and also add extra boning channels. After you've cut your boning, make sure that you also finish off the ends correctly by rounding off the corners and sanding them to shape them into place. You can also use steam from your iron to shape the boning itself to fit your body in a more comfortable way. To create the channels using the seam allowance, stitch parallel edge stitch rows on each side of the central seams. These stitch lines will secure the seam allowance and create a gap for the boning. You're going to stitch every seam allowance in the same way. The channel needs to be snug to fit your boning, and for example, a 7mm boning needs 9 to 10mm boning channel. This is why I'm not going to give you an exact size or measurement. Your boning will be very different from mine. Size of them is not generic throughout the world, and depending on the type that you buy, they will be different. So make sure that you measure your own and use an appropriate size of channel. You're then going to use your pattern to mark out the other boning channels. These are marked with a single line which indicates the center of the channel. To do this, I simply fold my pattern pieces on the diagonal along that line and line up the top of the pattern piece to my fabric and then mark it. Pin your twill tape over the markings through the center. Then you're going to stitch down the center of the tape and finally edge stitch along both sides of the tape to create 2 boning channels. It's very important that you leave the short edges unstitched and open so that we are able to put our boning into them. You may also want to clip the curve of the seam allowances so that they are able to lay nicer as they begin to form around your body. After we've stitched the bottom seam allowance of the bodice, it's time to insert the boning. Stitching together the lining and the main of our bodice pieces, close up the bottom of our boning channels. It's important that each piece of boning is shorter than the bodice is so that we're able to stitch along the seam allowance without going through the boning. We're going to push the boning down into each boning channel all the way to the bottom stitch. Then when you sew across that long seam allowance at the top of your bodice, you are going to close up each of those boning channels so the boning can't go anywhere. To add the boning to the center front, you're going to stitch the initial parallel line at 15mm or half an inch away from that turned front edge. And then you're going to pop the boning into that cavity at the center front, all the way in to where you just made that stitch line. Then you're going to close up that gap using the edge stitch. You need to repeat this for both sides of the center front. View B for the Aphrodite pattern is an optional skirt. This is added in once the front and back pieces have all been stitched at their seam allowances and once you have created the optional boning channels if you're creating them. The cut list for the skirt are on pages 9 and 10. You need to cut 2 front panels and 1 back panel. The length that is given in the pattern is for a midi length skirt, but of course you can modify this based on what you would like. It is made of rectangles, so you don't need to worry about changing the length and that affecting the width. You can just make it shorter or longer as you desire. The first step is to sew the skirt panels together at the side seam and finish them in your preferred method, whether an overlocker, serger or French seams. Then you're going to double fold and hem the center front edges of the skirt. Fold and press by 1 centimeter and then again by 2 centimeters. Finally, top stitch these center front hems using a 1.5 or half inch seam allowance. Repeat this for the hem at the bottom of the skirt. To prepare the skirt for attaching to the bodice, you need to gather the waist of the skirt to the same size as the bodice. You can do this by sewing 2 rows of machine gathering stitches, which is your longest stitch length on your machine, or you can use a single row of hand stitch gatherers at the top of the skirt. Pin the skirt waist to the long bottom edge of the main bodice fabric, right sides facing together. The side seams of the skirt should match to the side seams or underarm seams of the corset bodice. Once pinned into place loosely, you can gather the skirt to the same size as the corset and then baste the skirt to the main bodice fabric. Then place the lining over the skirt on the opposite side. The lining should be right side to the wrong side of the skirt. This will sandwich the skirt between the 2 layers of the bodice at the waist. Stitch all 3 layers together at the waist seam using a 2 centimeter or 1 inch seam allowance. Fold or roll the skirt up so that it is inside the corset and pin the top edge, lining up the seams along the top. From there, you can continue on using the main instructions, sewing the top seam allowance and then pulling not only the bodice but the skirt through so that the right sides come out. This is the burrito method. Now we need to create our closures. There are several ways to do this. There are full instructions inside the pattern. For this video, we're going to go through how to space and place your eyelets, but I'm not going to go into each of the individual methods. That is its own video. If you'd like to see it, head to our channel so that you can have a look at all of our videos. It's also really important when inserting metal eyelets that you refer to the manufacturer's instructions. To create your eyelets, you first need to mark them out. For the center front eyelets, space the eyelets 2 to 3 centimeters apart, center to center. Eyelets should be to the inside of the center front boning channel. For the shoulder straps, you need to mark the eyelets 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch down from the edge and in the very center of the strap. To use a zipper front closure, you need a jacket style zip which can be fully opened and closed. These are usually longer than the size that we need for this pattern, so we're going to cut and then fold the top end of the zip on each side. You can also find zips that have a magnet in the bottom of the closure to make connection a much easier process. Mark out the stitch line for your center front boning channels. These are at 2 centimeters and 1.5 centimeters from the center front edge. Repeat this on both sides. This width is of course a suggestion based on dressmaker's boning, and you need to adjust this to match the width of the boning that you're using. Stitch the first line of the casing only. This is at 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. Insert your boning into the cavity right against the stitch line. The second stitch line will be sewn after the zipper is inserted so that there is enough room for the top of the zipper tape inside the front cavity. Trim your zipper tape to size. This should be 1 centimeter larger than the opening of the center front. Fold the top of each zipper tape at a 90-degree angle. This fold will stop the zipper pull from coming off. This angled section will be inserted into the center front opening of the bodice and sewn inside the cavity where we're placing our boning. Insert the zip on either side of the center front closure. After inserting the center front boning, stitch your zip into place using a zipper foot attachment. Then finally, sew the second row of stitching for the boning channel. Push the boning right across to that 2 centimeter stitch line and then stitch your second row to encase the boning. Your Aphrodite Fashion Corset is now complete and ready for you to wear. Thank you so much for following along with this tutorial and for grabbing a copy of the pattern. If you haven't grabbed yours yet, check the description down below or follow the links on the video. Thank you so much for spending the time today. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you enjoy wearing your new garment. If you do make the Aphrodite pattern, we would love to see it. Please tag the Craefty Witch and or Amy of Melbourne on Instagram. You can also tag the Craefty Witch or Crafting Aphrodite as a hashtag on Instagram while they're still available. We would love to see any of the makes that you have. If you have any questions about this pattern or anything else, pop them in the comments below or head over to the website. Thank you so much for watching today. We'll see you later.